The island of Cuba is known for its rich culture, tumultuous history, and political struggles. Yet there is one peculiar aspect of the island that stands out: the southern part of Guantanamo Bay. This section of Cuba has been home to a U.S. naval base since 1903, while the rest of Cuba falls under the control of the Cuban government. This small part of the island remains under American control, creating an unusual dynamic that has endured for over a century. During Fidel Castro's reign, relations between the Cuban government and the United States reached their lowest point. Yet, despite the tensions, Castro never attempted to retake Guantanamo Bay, a small but critical part of his country's sovereignty. But why not? Why didn't Castro and Communist Cuba attempt to reclaim Guantanamo Bay and make the island whole once again? To answer that, we need to look back at the 19th century. It was in these closing years that Cuba revolted against Spanish rule. Like most revolutionaries, the Cubans expected that their territory would remain theirs once they had gained independence. However, this was not to be the case. Cuba's revolution against Spain. Cuba's struggle for independence was long and brutal. In the late 19th century, the Cuban people fought hard to free themselves from Spanish imperial rule. The War for Independence, which began in the 1860s, culminated in the War of Independence in 1895. The Cuban rebels, fueled by nationalistic fervor and the desire for freedom, believed that they would win not only their independence but also retain all of their territory, including the strategic and valuable Guantanamo Bay. However, as the war raged on, an unexpected actor entered the scene: the United States. In the late 1890s, tensions between Spain and the U.S. escalated. The U.S. had its eyes set on Spain's last remaining territories in the Western Hemisphere, particularly Cuba, which was strategically located and economically important. When the U.S. Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor in 1898, tensions reached a boiling point, and the U.S. declared war on Spain. This event marked the beginning of the Spanish-American War, a conflict that would significantly alter the future of Cuba. While many Americans were sympathetic to the Cuban cause, they were not necessarily interested in seeing Cuba become fully independent. Rather, many in the U.S. saw an opportunity to remove Spain from the Western Hemisphere and secure Cuba's position as a U.S. protectorate. The Teller Amendment, which passed in Congress, made it clear that the United States would not annex Cuba after defeating Spain. However, the Teller Amendment did not prevent the U.S. from securing strategic interests on the island. The United States' interest in Guantanamo Bay during the Spanish-American War. The U.S. military identified Guantanamo Bay as an ideal location for a naval base. It provided quick access to the Caribbean, which was strategically important for U.S. interests. Following Spain's defeat, Cuba was occupied by the United States, which promised to leave once the country established its own government. But the U.S. had no intention of giving up Guantanamo Bay. In 1901, the U.S. passed the Platt Amendment, which allowed for the U.S. to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it deemed necessary. This amendment effectively gave the United States control over Cuba's foreign policy and granted them the perpetual right to maintain a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. In exchange for this control, the U.S. agreed to lease the bay to Cuba for an annual payment of just $2,000, a sum that seemed insignificant compared to the value of the land and its strategic importance. Although Cuba's sovereignty was nominally intact, the U.S. had essentially secured a foothold on the island that would persist for decades to come. Over time, the Cuban government had little power to reclaim Guantanamo Bay, as U.S. forces stationed there acted with impunity, and the Cuban government was not in a position to confront the mighty U.S. military. The rise of Castro and tensions with the U.S.-THE situation remained relatively stable until the rise of Fidel Castro in the 1950s. Castro led a revolution that ousted the corrupt and pro-American dictator Fulgencio Batista, who had been propped up by the U.S. government. With Castro's victory, Cuba began to lean towards communism, much to the displeasure of the United States. Castro and his revolutionary government viewed the U.S. military presence at Guantanamo Bay as a symbol of imperialist occupation and a direct affront to Cuba's sovereignty. Castro's government made it clear that they intended to reclaim Guantanamo Bay. However, Castro's position was complicated by the fact that the U.S. was still a global superpower with significant influence in the region. Though the U.S. had relinquished some control over the island in the 1930s under Franklin D. Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay remained a constant presence. Castro's reaction and the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro's revolution was seen as a direct challenge to U.S. interests, not only in Cuba, but throughout Latin America. Castro's defiance towards U.S. imperialism, including his refusal to surrender Guantanamo Bay, quickly turned into one of the most significant sources of tension between the two countries. Although the United States had, at the time, abandoned its right to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs under the Roosevelt administration, the presence of a U.S. naval base so close to Castro's revolutionary government was a persistent thorn in his side. Castro's demands to reclaim Guantanamo Bay were quickly rebuffed by the United States. In 1959, Castro took the bold step of nationalizing all American-owned properties in Cuba, including those at Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. responded by imposing an economic embargo on Cuba and preparing for possible military intervention. Despite his revolutionary zeal, Castro knew that direct military confrontation with the U.S. would be disastrous for his new government. While Castro would have loved to have the U.S. leave Guantanamo Bay, he was fully aware of the geopolitical implications of such an action, the Bay of Pigs and the Cold War. One of the most significant events during Castro's early rule was the failed U.S.-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The invasion, which was carried out by Cuban exiles trained by the CIA, was an attempt to overthrow Castro's government and restore a pro-American regime in Cuba. The invasion was a catastrophic failure, and Castro's forces quickly defeated the invaders. The defeat solidified Castro's position in Cuba and demonstrated to the United States that Cuba was no longer a willing participant in U.S. hegemonic control. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion significantly improved Castro's relationship with the Soviet Union, which saw an opportunity to secure Cuba as a communist ally in the Western Hemisphere. In the wake of the invasion, Soviet support for Castro grew, and the Soviet Union stationed nuclear missiles in Cuba. This would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, a 13-day standoff between the U.S. and the USSR that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. During this period, Guantanamo Bay became an even more important symbol of the struggle between the U.S. and Cuba. The U.S. military presence there was a constant reminder of the tension that existed between the two nations. Yet, despite the heightened hostility, Castro never attempted a direct military takeover of the base. The fear of provoking an all-out war with the U.S. was too great. The U.S. stance on Guantanamo. As time passed, the U.S. government maintained its control over the Guantanamo Bay naval base. Despite Castro's objections and demands for its return, the U.S. refused to relinquish the territory. In the years following the Cuban Missile Crisis, relations between the two nations remained strained, but the U.S. continued to uphold its claim over Guantanamo Bay. The lease for the base remained in place, and the U.S. military continued to use it for strategic purposes, particularly during the Cold War. Even as the U.S. and Cuba became embroiled in ideological warfare during the Cold War, Castro's efforts to reclaim Guantanamo Bay remained largely symbolic. The Cuban government made no significant efforts to take the base by force, knowing that doing so would provoke an overwhelming military response from the United States. The U.S. presence in Cuba, particularly at Guantanamo Bay, became a reminder of the global power dynamics that shaped the Cuban Revolution and the relationship between the two countries. The legacy of Guantanamo Bay. Today, Guantanamo Bay remains under U.S. control, despite repeated calls from the Cuban government for its return. The U.S. continues to use the base for various purposes, including as a detention center for suspected terrorists. Castro's hopes of reclaiming the base were never realized, and the issue remains a symbol of the unresolved tensions between Cuba and the United States. In the end, the question of why Fidel Castro never attempted to take Guantanamo Bay by force is a complex one. Castro, ever the pragmatist, knew that reclaiming the base would come at a great cost, both in terms of international relations and the survival of his revolutionary government. The U.S., as a global superpower, was not about to give up such a strategic asset without a fight. And so, Castro's diplomatic attempts to get the U.S. to leave continued to be one of the unresolved issues in the long and strained relationship between the two countries.